Addiction doesn't just claim lives, it suffocates voices that once graced the stage as symbols of beauty and talent. It strips away beauty, memory, reason, and ultimately, the will to live. Do you know of a female singer who entered rehab 17 times who collapsed in a public restroom? Curled up next to an unmarked bag of drugs, some were even handcuffed to hospital beds as their hearts beat their final moments. They were once queens of a generation, but behind the voices that silenced the world were sleepless nights and agonizing withdrawals from illicit substances. What turned them into mere shadows of their former selves? Join us as we delve into the tragedies of 19 legendary Black R&B women who battled addiction. 19. Etta James, 17 rehabs and an irrevocable fall. First on the list is a legend who sang as if nothing could destroy her, but reality was far more bitter. Etta James once said there were mornings she woke up not knowing where she was or whether she had lived or died the day before. For most, that's a sign of illness. For Etta, it was just another morning in decades entwined with substances that blurred her mind and tore her soul daily. From her late teens, Etta spiraled into a vortex no one could pull her from. When she sang "All I Could Do Was Cry," no one knew she cried the most, not on stage, but backstage after the applause faded. She tried to break free, entering rehab 17 times, but each time returned with trembling limbs, cold hands, and a mind that no longer believed in normalcy. Everything came crashing down on the night of June 17, 1973. Etta was arrested at Los Angeles Airport after security found nothing in her suitcase but items related to her old habits. She didn't resist or explain, just silently offered her hands to be cuffed. Afterward, the court required her to wear an electronic monitor around her ankle for months. The image of Etta James, sitting in a small rented apartment in Compton, ankle monitor in place, cigarette in hand, staring blankly out the window, is something those who loved her voice avoid mentioning in interviews. In her final years, Etta gradually forgot everything. She couldn't remember song lyrics or recognize her own voice on old records. She'd sit alone for hours, headphones on, smiling vaguely like someone who had lost her mind. Etta James passed away in 2012. When the news broke, people recalled "At Last," the title Queen of R&B, and an indomitable musical spirit. But perhaps those who truly followed her remember one thing: some voices are so beautiful that even the singers can't bear them for a lifetime, as each note reopens old wounds. 18. Billie Holiday, the addict handcuffed to her hospital bed. The next tragedy comes from a woman who was once the soul of a generation, only to die silently in her hospital bed, guarded like a criminal. Billie Holiday was heavily addicted from an early age, but no one could blame her. When pain becomes your only companion, you'll do anything to soothe it. In her world, where Black women had no right to be weak, substances that numbed memory and softened fear were the last resort. She was an icon of her era, a legendary R&B singer not for her looks or lavish performances, but for a voice that carried every crack. Strange Fruit wasn't just a song, it was a direct cut into America's face. But that very song led to surveillance, performance bans, and isolation from grand halls. She was pushed into dingy bars filled with smoke and alcohol where no one could hear her lyrics clearly. To stand and sing, she relied on doses that kept her balanced, prevented tears before crowds, and held her broken heart together. Some nights, she was brought on stage with eyes barely open. Other nights, she forgot lyrics mid-song as withdrawal hit too quickly. Those close to her said Billie had been dying for a long time. Her body just hadn't stopped moving. By May 1959, she was admitted to Knickerbocker Hospital in a state beyond endurance. Her lungs failed, abdomen bloated, skin pale, and heartbeat too weak to measure. But more terrifying was when police entered her hospital room days later with an arrest warrant for alleged drug possession. Though immobile, Billie was handcuffed to the bed's metal frame, under 24-hour guard. They didn't remove the cuffs even when doctors said she had only days to live, and she knew it. A nurse on duty that day recalled Billie saying nothing all afternoon. She just stared out the window, eyes cloudy, as if waiting for someone to save her. But no one came. On the morning of July 17, 1959, Billie Holiday took her last breath under guard. Her bank account held less than $1. No grand funeral, no one by her side, no music, just a cold hospital bed, a soul judged before death, and a world still learning to love those who dare to speak the truth. Yet, whenever Strange Fruit plays, the room falls silent, not because the music is too good, but because something in that voice still breathes, struggles, and screams from beyond. And that's why Billie never truly disappeared. 17. Florence Ballard, performing in an unconscious state. Florence Ballard once stood under the spotlight, alongside Diana Ross and Mary Wilson, igniting America with radiant beauty and songs that set the hall ablaze. The Supremes were not just a music group, they were a timeless symbol, and Florence, with her warm voice and dreamy eyes, was once the emotional heart of the group. But then, that light faded quickly, and she was the first to be left in the dark. After internal conflicts, Florence was removed from the group in 1967. That turning point not only stripped her of her career but also her identity. No one called her Florence of the Supremes anymore. Only an unemployed, disappointed woman remained, not even strong enough to be angry. Alcohol became her refuge every morning, afternoon, and night, like a thin blanket covering a decaying memory. One night in 1971, when Florence was rejected for a small performance contract at a local nightclub because she was no longer suitable for the current market image, she went home, sat alone in the living room, drank an entire bottle of cheap liquor, then went out into the snowy garden just to cry. A neighbor recounted that the next morning. They found her asleep on a bench outside, hair disheveled, face swollen, still clutching an old Supremes album as if it were the only proof she had ever existed. Each time she was invited back to the stage, Florence appeared in an unconscious state, causing those who once adored her to quietly leave the front rows. She could no longer remember the lyrics, couldn't control her steps, and sometimes sang while crying for no reason. No one had the patience to call it art anymore. At the end of her life, Florence lived on social assistance, once had to go to court to seek custody of her children with only a few $100s in hand. In 1976, she was hospitalized with kidney failure and aortic inflammation. When she died, Florence Ballard had exactly $1,823 in her account. No record label sent flowers, no celebrities attended the funeral. If Etta once struggled with herself, Florence seemed to have given up very early, and perhaps, the scariest thing is not death, but when someone who once moved the entire world has to live as if they never existed. 16. Tammy Terrell pills that erased the pain in the late 1960s. No one in America didn't know Tammy Terrell. She was the youngest voice heavily promoted by Motown, the indispensable half in legendary duets with Marvin Gaye. Songs like Ain't No Mountain High Enough or You're All I Need to Get By echoed across radios, stages, and the hearts of millions. But while the world was immersed in that bright exterior, Tammy lived each day in silent confusion, tied to seemingly harmless pills that led her away from herself. Tammy began using medication in 1965 when a hectic tour schedule caused chronic insomnia, pounding headaches, and exhaustion so severe she couldn't get up in the morning. She sought a doctor, and everything started with seemingly harmless prescriptions. One pill helped her sleep, one helped her wake up, one helped her sing, one helped her feel nothing at all. After a few months, none were effective without increasing the dose, and after a year, she no longer knew who the real Tammy was. In 1967, during a performance in Virginia, Tammy collapsed on stage into Marvin Gaye's arms. That moment is remembered. But it wasn't the first fall. Weeks earlier, she had fainted in the studio, the pill bottle still open beside a glass of water. A technician recalled that one day Tammy stood for an hour in the studio, eyes fixed on the microphone but not singing, as if her mind had been drained of memories, leaving only the image of herself struggling. After the collapse, doctors discovered a brain tumor, but even during treatment, Tammy had to record, had to be called back to the stage. She continued relying on pills to maintain her smile, her rhythm, and a dream that was cracking each day. Tammy Terrell died on March 16, 1970 at just 24 years old. In her final weeks, she no longer recognized those around her, couldn't remember her own lyrics. People say she died of illness, but to those who saw her rummaging through her purse for the next dose during a rehearsal, the truth was much clearer. She didn't die from a brain tumor. She died from an industry that had learned to hide addiction behind the spotlight. 15. Betty Wright, the deadly white lines. There are pains that cannot be buried, only lulled temporarily. Betty Wright did that, every day, for decades, using something that quieted her mind but fractured her heart a little more each time. In 1971, at just 17, Betty became a nationwide sensation with the hit Clean Up Woman, selling over 1 million copies. She was hailed as the young star representing the new soul of Southern R&B, connecting raw emotions with storytelling through music. But in 1986, Betty's life took an irreversible turn when her eldest son, Patrick, was shot dead in a brawl. She never recovered from that shock. In a later interview, when asked about her son, Betty only said one sentence: "I had to find a way not to go crazy, and the only way she knew was to let illicit substances seep into her veins, soothing every sound in her head, including the call of the child who would never return." Initially, her family and team thought she was just sad, but gradually, they began to worry. Once, in 1989, she was invited to record at a studio in Miami, but for 4 hours, Betty didn't sing a single note. She just sat staring out the window, hands trembling, breathing heavily. When an assistant found a small note in her pocket with the handwritten words, "Just this once," no one in the room dared to ask anything further. The following years were a series of silent treatments. Betty sometimes got better, sometimes seemed to have completely escaped it. But then, just a Memorial Day, an old photo, or a song that evoked memories was enough to make everything collapse again. Betty Wright passed away on May 10, 2020 due to cancer, but those who loved her knew well that death had begun long ago, from the moment she lost her child, from the moment she lost herself, and from the moment no music could save the woman who once brought her voice to an entire generation. 14. Betty Davis, the addiction to cut off from the outside world in the early 1970s. Betty Davis was a fierce funk icon, rising not only because of her sharp voice but also due to her bold, gender-liberating performances that led many radio stations to refuse to air her music. She was once Miles Davis's wife, praised by Jimi Hendrix, shook the funk scene with just a powerful growl, and was the first woman daring to place the image of black female empowerment on album covers without concealment or compromise. But that light didn't last. Rejected by record labels, deemed dangerous to young audiences by the media, Betty was gradually pushed out of the music center. By 1980, she completely disappeared from the industry, releasing no more albums and no longer performing. Few knew that behind that silence were prolonged depressions, broken trust, and increasing dependence on substances that blurred her mind, so she wouldn't have to be alert when old memories resurfaced. An old friend recalled visiting her in 1986, having to wait nearly an hour outside her Pittsburgh apartment because Betty couldn't get up. When she opened the door, her hair was messy, eyes dark-circled, and hands trembling slightly. She only said one sentence: "I've lived long enough to know that no one really wants to hear the truth." In her later years, Betty lived in seclusion, refusing all interviews, not performing, not releasing music, and almost cutting off contact with the world. Although she died in 2022, many still say that Betty Davis had disappeared long ago. From the moment she stopped believing that music could save a woman too strong to be forgiven, yet too tired to keep struggling. 13. Phyllis Hyman, the dangerous silence. There are voices that astonish people with their perfection, but that very perfection becomes unsustainable in a life full of cracks. Phyllis Hyman was once the gem of 1980s soul, possessing a rich, powerful voice that could silence an entire auditorium with just one note. She performed alongside Dionne Warwick, was called the strongest female voice after Aretha Franklin by Natalie Cole, and was a great hope among black critics in New York. But after the lights dimmed, Phyllis sank into prolonged silence, a quietness no one recognized as a dangerous signal. In the mid-1980s, she was diagnosed with mood disorders, frequently falling into emptiness, insomnia, and irritability, prescribed pills, poured drinks, all just to soothe a few hours a day when she didn't feel consumed. At one point, her family had to remove her from the studio because she couldn't complete a 3-minute recording. Once, Phyllis locked herself in a hotel room in Detroit, not eating, not answering calls, not responding to her manager, just to sit and repeatedly write one sentence in her diary: I tried, but it's still not enough. Near the end of her life, she often repeated a sentence backstage, like a sad mantra: I want to rest for a long time, but I don't know how to stop. On June 30th, 1995, a few hours before a performance at the Apollo Theater, Phyllis was found unconscious in her Manhattan apartment. On the table were her hastily written final words. No blame, no accusations, just a request to leave in silence. She passed away at 45. On the day her new album was released, no promotional words were heard. Only the audience standing under the Apollo Theater that night, waiting endlessly for the stage lights to come on, began to understand that some voices, when silent, leave a void greater than any applause. 12. Mary Wells, when the glass became the final microphone. There are voices that once made all of America pause to listen. Mary Wells was one of them. In 1964, when My Guy played and soared to #1 on the Billboard chart, she became the first female artist to bring Motown to glory, dubbed the First Lady of Motown during the label's defining era for modern soul music. However, not everyone retains the spotlight for long, leaving Motown in her 20s due to contract disputes. Mary believed she would continue to explode at bigger labels, but life didn't play out like the song she once sang. In the late 1960s, Mary's name began to fade. Subsequent albums were not well received, performance invitations dwindled, and the stage grew colder each time she stepped out. In the following years, alcohol began to seep into her life like a silent, persistent friend. Initially, just a few drinks to dispel the sense of failure after each sparsely attended show, but by the end of the decade, alcohol had replaced the microphone. It was said that during a 1983 performance in Ohio, Mary took the stage in a sparkling dress reminiscent of her peak days, but stood dazed for nearly a minute without uttering a word. When prompted by the musician, she smiled slightly and said, "Oh, I thought I came here to hear someone else sing." From the mid-1980s, Mary almost disappeared from the music scene. She lived alone, no longer signing new contracts, no longer appearing on television. When diagnosed with throat cancer, she lacked the financial means for full treatment, although Motown sent support. It arrived late and only covered part of the hospital expenses. Mary Wells passed away on July 26, 1992. No stage lights welcomed her return, but that voice, gentle, full of emotion, once the voice of an entire generation, still echoes somewhere, whenever someone needs a tender love song to soothe a long night. 11. Jean Knight, When Addiction Erodes Memory. The cruelest thing in Jean Knight's life wasn't the audience's forgetfulness, nor the fact that only one hit survived the years, but the feeling of gradually no longer recognizing herself. No one saw that moment. It didn't come as a sudden fall. It came slowly, silently, a little each day, as if someone was dripping water into her soul. So that one morning, everything inside had diluted to the point of losing its old shape. When Mr. Big Stuff made stages across America explode in 1971, Jean was still full of desire, full of illusions that she was just beginning. But what followed wasn't a series of continued successes, but a void. She began drinking more to fill the silence, then turned to stronger substances when alcohol no longer soothed her trembling hands and fragmented memory. At some point, small pills began appearing in her purse, in her coat pocket, on her dressing table, gradually becoming an indispensable part of every performance. One autumn day in 1991 at a community performance in Baton Rouge, Jean stood on stage silently for nearly 10 minutes, her eyes lost in the air while the band had nearly finished the intro of the very song that had brought her to the top. When prompted, she turned to the musician, bewildered like a stranger in her own life, and softly asked, "Which show are we rehearsing for?" That question wasn't a joke, but a clear sign that not only her voice but also her awareness of time, of reality, was retreating from her bit by bit. Addiction doesn't need to be sensational. It doesn't push. It just quietly erodes every relationship, every opportunity. Every time people try to believe she'll be on time, will remember the lyrics, will still be herself, eventually. Jean could no longer work, nor was she invited anymore. People still loved the song, but no longer knew how to love the woman who had sung it with all her youth and belief that she could go beyond a single recording. Jean Knight passed away in 2023. No fanfare, no farewell stage, but in a few old bars in Louisiana, when Mr. Big Stuff plays. Someone sits silently because they know that behind each lyric was a life that slowly shattered without anyone noticing. 10. Mickey Howard couldn't even recognize her own face. Mickey Howard was once the sweet voice of 1980s R&B, often compared to Anita Baker, delivering Billboard charting love songs, and standing as a gentle yet powerful symbol of black womanhood. But in the quiet years after the spotlight faded and the contracts thinned out, Mickey began depending on what she called a mental break, something that initially helped her cope with stress, then quickly turned into a bottomless pit. She stopped appearing at shows. At times, people assumed she had retired to recover, but in truth, she was drifting homeless across cities, with no home, no assistant, not even a phone. Once, sometime in the mid-2000s, she was found unconscious in a public restroom in Los Angeles, lying next to a worn-out handbag, with no ID, and no one recognizing who she was. When she woke up in the hospital, It took her nearly 2 days to remember her name. Looking at an old photo the doctor handed her, she burst into tears and asked, "Was I really that person?" Addiction didn't just nearly cost her life. It took her voice, her memories, and even the identity that once carried her so confidently across stages. In the end, Mickey Howard didn't need to die to lose everything. She just had to forget she once lived so brightly. It sounds hard to believe, but the next woman fell into an even worse state. She was so far gone, no one even recognized her. Natalie Cole addiction that destroyed her body, the daughter of legend, Nat King Cole. Natalie once soared to the top with a voice as clear as crystal and a solo career that proved she wasn't just her father's shadow. But behind the elegance lay a brutal truth: needles in hotel bathrooms, bruises hidden beneath velvet sleeves, and hospital records confessing that for years, the only thing she let into her body was what no one dared to name. At one point, she was using so much she needed regular blood transfusions but kept her condition secret until her body could no longer carry the lie. In 2008, doctors told Natalie she had contracted hepatitis C, likely from shared needles in the past. Her liver began to fail, her body swelled, and her voice weakened with exhaustion. She once said in an interview, "I lost my voice to the very thing that once helped me keep singing." That line wasn't just sad, it sounded like a long overdue apology to herself. Natalie Cole died in 2015, not on stage, but surrounded by medical equipment, when one of the purest voices in R&B no longer had the strength to whisper her final song. 8. Millie Jackson. Years of alcohol catching up. Millie Jackson was the boldest female voice in 1970s R&B, known for fiery tracks and fearless performances. But one winter night in 1994 backstage in Chicago, she was found alone, not answering anyone, staring blankly into a mirror as if unaware of where she was. What kept her off stage that night wasn't illness. It was the toll of years spent using alcohol and pills to soften the days after the stage lights dimmed. She once said the most dangerous part wasn't being drunk, it was being sober. When she had to face a voice she no longer controlled. Millie once sang for 3 straight nights and couldn't remember a single word. Addiction didn't erase her career in one blow. It chipped away, making her voice raspy, her memory fade, and eventually leaving her afraid of her own recordings. Maybe she never sang a wrong note. Maybe the only mistake was forgetting who she was singing for or why. 7. Vanity poison running through her veins. Next is a woman who was so obsessed with beauty that it ended up destroying her. Vanity, the sexiest singer ever to emerge from Prince's shadow, was iconic not just for her looks, but for the fire in her gaze that seemed to set stages ablaze. But that fire wasn't strong enough to save her from the darkness she created. In the late 1980s, Vanity began using stimulants to maintain her figure, then more to sleep, to forget, to walk into the studio without fearing her fading relevance. One night, she collapsed in a Las Vegas dressing room just 5 minutes after stepping on stage. When paramedics took her to the hospital, her heart was erratic, her lungs weak. They didn't know she had been living like this for years. By 1994, her kidneys were failing. Doctors warned her if she didn't stop, she wouldn't live to see another fall. But when she woke up from her first dialysis, the only thing she asked was, "Am I still beautiful?" Addiction had stolen her voice and even the pride that once made her stand tall before crowds without a single introduction. 6. Laverne Baker lost her legs to alcohol. Some people fall once and never stand again. For Laverne Baker, the downfall was slow, like the pouring of each drink meant to ease the loneliness when no one called to book her anymore. She had once been a blazing star of rhythm and blues, topping charts before Motown even arrived on the scene, but by the late 1970s, as disco and funk took over, Laverne was pushed aside. No stage, no label, only a radio in her tiny apartment, where she drank steadily from morning to night just to make time pass faster. She didn't call it addiction. She called it survival, something to keep her from feeling useless. But by 1994, during a rare appearance in Atlantic City, her legs gave out. Her body was slowly paralyzed by vascular damage from years of alcohol use. Doctors had to amputate both legs within months. When Laverne woke from surgery, she didn't cry or scream. She just looked out the window, sighed, and whispered, "The stage left me long ago. I was the one who came late." 5. Barbara Lewis. Even she forgot her own songs. There are small rooms where once powerful voices fall silent in frightening ways. Barbara Lewis lived in such a room in a cold Michigan town where winters stretched longer than memory. She had once been the golden voice of the 1960s, rising with Hello Stranger and tender ballads that melted even the most stoic hearts. But after those early successes, Barbara slowly faded, not because she was forgotten, but because she could no longer hold on to herself. Since the early 1980s, she lived in silence, trapped by anxiety, depression, and a growing dependency on sleeping pills. What began as a way to rest eventually became the only thing that numbed the feeling of being forgotten. People said she sometimes wouldn't leave her house for weeks, wouldn't answer the door or phone. When a reporter came to interview her for the 30th anniversary of Hello Stranger, Barbara opened the door with a glazed look and gently asked, "Are you sure I sang that song?" Addiction didn't kill her, but it stole her voice, her memories, and the belief that she had once been heard. You thought this list had already reached rock bottom? Think again. There are stories ahead that feel eerily like a curse in disguise. 4. Sylvia Robinson needed 10 pills just to get out of bed. No one expected that the woman who birthed an empire of hip-hop would one day struggle just to wake up without crying from pain. Sylvia Robinson, the woman behind Rapper's Delight, dubbed the godmother of hip-hop, spent her final years as a prisoner in her own body. After years of running Sugar Hill Records, legal battles, personal losses, and financial pressure, Sylvia began taking painkillers for cervical spine degeneration. Within months, her dosage doubled. She couldn't sleep without them, then couldn't attend meetings, remember new mixes, or even tell what day it was without them. By the late 2000s, Sylvia had nearly vanished. Visitors said she slept more than she spoke. Her gaze was slow, her reflexes sluggish, and the hands that once signed historic deals now trembled holding a glass. She died in 2011 of heart failure, but to those closest to her, she had left the world long before, when the pills replaced her voice, her memory, and the woman who once made history. 3. Denise Williams, addicted to control. Denise Williams had a rare 4-octave range, made Let's Hear It for the Boy a Billboard smash, and convinced the world that soul could float like clouds and still pierce the heart. But because she loved her voice so much, Denise began using anti-inflammatories, mucolytics, and vocal relaxants to preserve it, drugs initially prescribed in safe doses, but quickly becoming a dependency. Once, while recording in Los Angeles in the early 2000s, her voice gave out mid-session. Instead of resting, she asked her assistant for more pills. 3 hours later, she couldn't remember the lyrics she'd just recorded. She used to say she wasn't addicted to music, but to the feeling of total control over every high note. The more she tried to preserve, the more she lost. In later years, her throat was often raw, her memory foggy, and her pitch unpredictably off. One doctor bluntly told her, "There's no drug that keeps a voice without costing your nerves." Denise kept singing, but by the end, was it still truly her voice or just a sound created by medicine? 2. Barbara Mason couldn't tell day from night. Barbara Mason once moved all of America with Yes, I'm Ready, a gentle ballad that made her a teen idol in the early 1960s. But as she grew older, her voice disappeared from airwaves, and she herself faded into the shadows backstage. She withdrew into a small apartment in Philadelphia, avoiding crowds and growing dependent on sleeping pills to escape nameless fears. Family members recalled how, at one point, Barbara couldn't tell day from night. Only her pill schedule reminded her she was still alive. In her final years, she rarely left home, no longer performed, no longer sang, only occasionally replaying her old recordings as if to remind herself she once existed. 1. Zulema Kuso. Crushed by her failures, Zulema Kuso was once a sought-after soul singer in the early 1970s, her powerful voice and bold persona turning heads after she left faith, hope, and charity to go solo. But after a painful divorce and several studio failures, she sank into a routine of tranquilizers. By 1983, Zulema had vanished from TV, stopped touring, and barely opened her mouth to sing. She lived in isolation in Jacksonville, dodging calls and rejecting reunion offers from former colleagues. Neighbors said they sometimes heard music at night from her apartment, an old track in her own voice, but never saw the lights on, as if she only played it to hear herself again. Then let the silence return. These 19 women weren't just legendary singers, they were symbols of a generation, Black female artists who soared to glory, only to spiral into darkness with no one there to catch them. Which one of these 19 names broke your heart the most? Do you see them as victims or as survivors? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to uncover more truths hidden behind the spotlight of another era.